I'm Gail Lesser-Gerber. I am from Los Angeles, California, and it's been cold out here and rainy the last couple days. I am Ben Lesser's daughter, second generation, and I want to welcome you and just touch on a little bit about Zahor. Because education is so important, we recently launched the first ever Holocaust educational website taught by a survivor, Ben Lesser himself, and it's called the Zahor Holocaust Curriculum. On our website, we call it ZHC. It was designed for teachers by teachers, and it's a free website. It's a easy turnkey with lesson plans, videos, photographs, factual timeline. We also have you don't have to, students do have to register. We don't share the information with anybody, but it is absolutely free for students, teachers, or any history enthusiast that wants to learn a little bit more or find out a little bit more. We will put the URL up for it a little bit later on. So I'm asking you to please take the time and visit our website, www.zahorfoundation.org. And within there, you will find our shout out section. I shout out. We want you to share this with your students. It's a platform where students have a chance to say what they shout out for and what they believe in. We're trying to get 6 million shout outs to be the voices for the voices that were silenced. And we also have on our website this incredible section called Ben's AI Artificial Intelligence Story File. And that's where you will be able to talk to Ben, ask him questions personally for years, decades after he is gone. You'll be able just to talk to him through the artificial intelligence. And that is live now. And it's a great project for students and teachers to do with the classroom or doing directly from their home. Besides doing it on a computer, students will also be able to do it on their cell phones too. There's so much about Zahor in our programs that we do. My dad is 92 years old and he won't stop. He's writing all the time. He's creating all the time. He can't sleep at night because he's always coming up with new ways to be able to make sure that his message is carried on to the generations that are to follow, so that the Holocaust will never be forgotten, and also that his story will never be forgotten. There are very few survivors today that can talk the way that Ben does, that have been in concentration camps, hard labor, been on death trains. Matter of fact, the most notorious death train that was 3 weeks long, Ben is the only living survivor today of, and a 7-week death march. So he's going to tell you his story, but his story is unique because he fled from Poland to Hungary and as a young boy, and he has quite a story to tell. So without any further ado, I want to introduce you to my dad, Ben Lesser.
Thank you, Gail. Beautiful introduction. And I'm always honored to speak to teachers, and because I feel that you are the future. You're going to keep the memory alive. The world is trying to forget, and we count on you. So I love to talk to teachers. And without further ado, let me start out. I was about not quite 11 years old, and I lived in Krakow, Poland. My father was from Krakow. My mother was from Munkacs, which was Hungary. And her part of the family was from Munkacs. And every year, my mother would take us kids to Munkacs in the summer to be with her family. In the winter, we would come back to Krakow to go to school. And this is actually our home was in Krakow, but we felt like we had two homes. And Krakow, we lived on a major thoroughfare called Starowieczna. It's a major street, just something like Wilshire in Los Angeles. And one early morning in September of 1939, this whole building that we lived on the lower floor, the three windows that we're pointing to were part of our apartment. The third window, the end, was my bedroom. And this whole building started to shake and rattle. So I ran to the window to see what happened. And then I looked out, I saw tanks were rolling down the street. Following the tanks, there were half tracks. And every few steps, a soldier would jump out of the half tracks, get on the sidewalk. And this is how they occupied the city. There was no fighting. And following them were the Wehrmacht with their shiny black boots and their goose steps. It was quite impressionable for an 11-year-old kid. And we kids didn't really know what to expect. But if my parents knew something, they didn't tell us. I think they knew a lot because Kristallnacht happened 1 year earlier from Germany and Austria, and a lot of the Polish Jews were evicted to go back to Poland. Poland wouldn't let them in, but that's a different story. But I'm sure my father found out what happened on Kristallnacht. But no one really expected how far the Nazis would take it. We felt we'll probably will be discriminated in business and such. By the way, my father's business was wine and syrup. He had the wine and syrup manufacturing in Krakow, and he also had a chocolate factory where he was the first man to create chocolate-covered wafers, something like Kit Kat, only in those days it was in the shape of little animals and things with tinfoil on it. Every time my father would come home, us kids would search his pockets to see if he can find any goodies. And he usually made sure he had some in his pocket. So anyway, I did have two sisters and two brothers. And my parents, we were a family of seven. Family of seven. The only survivors from all of us that you see in the picture was my sister Lola on my right side there and myself. We were the only two survivors out of the whole family. Everyone else was slaughtered by the Nazis. Here's Lola, my sister, that was taken about 15 or 20 years ago. So anyway, after that happened, my father called us kids into the dining room and sat us down on the chairs and said, look, kids, from this day on, you're all adults. There are no more children. You have to obey. You have to listen to us. No more crying or disobedience, because we don't know what's going to happen now. And sure enough, you know, new ordinances started coming in all the time. But on the 5th day of occupation of Krakow, we found out what Nazi brutality, terrorism was like. A truck pulls up early in the morning to our gate in front of our building. Around 5 a.m., they started to bang on the building. And the super came running out. He says, what's happening? And the soldiers in the truck, all they wanted to know is where the Jewish people lived. And he was quick to oblige. He says, the Lessers live here. And there was another family on the other side of the gate, a young couple. They had two daughters, about little younger than I. And the mother gave birth to an infant little boy about 2 months earlier. And they lived there, wonderful family. And of course, the Nazis came in early, this was 5 a.m., breaking down the door and pistol whipping all of us while we were in bed. And they were, in their hands, they had sex, open sex, and they were yelling, throw in all your valuables, money, gold, jewelry. And my mother, they pulled off all her earrings and her chain, but whatever, the necklace she had. And they were beating up my father to open up the safe. While my father is opening up the safe, we hear the screaming in our neighbor's apartment. And my sister Lola, the one who survived, and I ran out through the back door to the kitchen, into the other apartment to their kitchen. And when we came in, this is what we saw. We saw this monster was holding the infant by its legs and swinging it, yelling to the parents, make him shut up. And the parents and the daughters are screaming, our baby, don't hurt our baby. And with a smirk on his face, you can see he was enjoying what he was doing. He smashes the baby's head into a doorpost, killing it instantly. I'll never forget that baby screams and that sudden silence and what came out of the head. I have nightmares over this. And of course, all of us jumped on this monster. And when the other bodies, his bodies heard what was going on, they came running in and they saw what happened. I guess they were a little shocked themselves to see something like that. And they told him, come on, Hans, let's go. They pulled us off of him and they pistol whipped us and they gathered up all the goodies that they took from us. They threw it into the truck and they took off. That was the 5th day of occupation. And from that point on, new ordinances kept coming in one after another. And of course, my father's business, he went to the chocolate factory and there were guards stationed and they chased him away. And then he went to the wine and syrup factory, the guards stationed and they chased him away, confiscated. Imagine a man works all his life to support the family, and just like that, it's taken away from you. Ordinances started to come in new and furious. One ordinance was there was curfew. The Jewish people could not be outside of their apartments or houses from 7 to 7. I'm sorry, from 7 in the evening to 7 in the morning, we had to be inside a house. And we had to have the Star of David on our armbands. Now, if any Jewish person disobeyed any of these ordinances, there were no judges, no juries, not even prisons. The only punishment for the Jewish people was they were shot. They were shot on the spot. If you were out before 7 o'clock in the morning and they saw you and they asked for your ID, and of course you showed and they say you're Jewish, they saw you're Jewish anyway because you had the Star of David. They simply shot you. And every morning there were dead bodies all over the place in Krakow. New ordinances came in that we couldn't travel anymore, we couldn't work here, we couldn't work there. And pretty soon there was an ordinance that the Jewish people can no longer reside in Krakow. But they gave us a choice. The only time in history they ever gave us a choice. The choice was, if you want to stay in Krakow, you have to go in the sections that they made the ghetto out of it. And I'm sure you all know what a ghetto is. And of course, or the choice was that you can leave Krakow and live in a small community neighboring Krakow, but you cannot live in a big city. So my sister Lola, she was a beautiful girl anyway, and she had a young man who was pursuing her. And he comes to my father and he says, Mr. Lesser, you know how I feel about Lola. Someday I'd love to marry her, but do me a favor. I will take care of everything for you. Just come to the same communities that my parents and I are going. And my father gave him a choice to go to the ghetto or go to Neapolomice, to that community. Obviously, he agreed to go to community. This young man's name was Michael Lieber. And Michael went ahead and he hired the wagon with the driver, horse and buggy. And we were allowed to take everything that we can with us except furniture. We were not allowed to pick up any furniture. We had to leave it where it is. So he helped us pack. And while he's packing, my father tells us that he had saved up 1,000 American dollars for a rainy day. Now, 1,000 American dollars was a small fortune in those days. So he took a religious book and he pasted it in between the pages. He pasted the dollars and he closed up the book and he put it in a sack full of books. And there were about 2 sacks full of Jewish literature, Jewish religious books. And we're now leaving Krakow. Everything is loaded on the wagons and we go on the wagon. Now there were 6 of us. Remember, my sister Goldie, my oldest sister, when the war broke out, she was visiting my grandparents in Munkac. And as the war broke out, she was stuck with her grandparents. So she wasn't with us. The family was 7, but we were only 6 now. And we go on the wagon and we're leaving Krakow. As soon as we passed to the outside of the city of Krakow, we're being stopped by the Nazis. Halt. And 2 husky Nazis jump on the wagon, and all they wanted was Jewish literature. Do we have any Jewish books? And they saw 2 sacks full of books. They picked them up and heaved it on the side of the road, which had a mountain full of books. They knew that all the Jewish people leaving Krakow have to go through this road. And so they were confiscating the books and they were going to have a bonfire after everybody passed. So my sister Lola, she spoke a beautiful German. We all spoke German because my mother insisted that we learn German, which was the language of the elite in Europe at the time, just like English is today. Anywhere in the world you could speak German and most people would understand. The same goes for English today. So she walks up to this monster and she says to him, look, my father is a writer. He wrote his autobiography. Let him keep this one book. And he looks at her. Maybe he liked the way she spoke. He says, okay, I'll give you 5 minutes if you can find it. So all of us in the family started to climb on the mountain of book, looking for this one book with the money. And of course, all these books look alike. They were either brown or leather bound or black. And when you climb on books, you slide down. After 5 minutes, he chased us away. My father is going to a new community. Michael arranged for us to live in that community. but he has a family of 6, not a penny to feed the family. And it's not like a Jewish person can get a job. They were not allowed to hire Jewish people. So you can just imagine my father's face at that time. And sure enough, he continues. We arrived to Neapolomice in a little community. And this is the house that my sister Lola, she was a beautiful artist, and she painted that from her memory. She painted that in 1950, 4 years, actually 6 years after the war finished. So you'll see more pictures of her. So no, it's my sister Lola. By the way, those pictures, the originals, are a Yad Vashem in Israel, and we only have copies. When my father arrived to that apartment, this house housed the farmer of one side, and the other side was our apartment. In our apartment, between the 2 apartments, there was a baking oven, a big baking oven where you can bake your own breads. So my father arrives, and my future brother-in-law heard what happened to his money. He brought him a sack full of flour, figuring he'll be able to bake bread to feed the family. When my father saw the flour, his face lit up. He started to bake pretzels, not bread. Why pretzels? All you need for pretzels is flour, water, and salt. And those ingredients he had. He baked the pretzels, then he took them to the neighboring bars, offered it for sale. It was a novelty, and they started to buy the pretzels. Now he could bake a bread to feed the family. And before we knew it, my father became a baker in that community. From that house that where we lived in, and from that baking oven, he became a baker in that community. And I was 12 years old at the time, and I helped him bake. And to this day, I still remember some of the recipes, and I enjoy baking sometimes for the family. Excuse me. My sister Lola marries Michael, and my oldest brother, Moishi, marries, and he moves out of the house. Lola's wedding picture you see here in front of you was in the yard of our house, which was not allowed. We were not allowed to gather more than 5 people outside of the family. But in the yard, there were many more pictures. They're not all in the photograph. There were about 30 of us. And out of these 30 people, only 3 of us survived, Michael and Lola and myself. That's me. By the way, this is my mother and my little brother, Tuli, next to her. It's hard to believe that none of these people survived. This is my picture, the only photographs that I had at that age as a child. And this was going on for a while, but it didn't last very long. After Michael and Lola moved into a duplex, the owner of the duplex, who lived next door, happened to be the mayor of that community. One day he comes home, he says, Michael and Lola, save yourselves. We heard rumors that there may be a podlava, a raid against the Jewish people, either tonight or tomorrow night. So save yourselves. When Michael heard that, he went out and he hired a driver with a wagon, horse and buggy, And in the middle of the night, we snuck out with whatever we can carry, and we left Neapolomice. Now, only I, my little, well, from our family, my brother who was married, he went someplace else. I don't know. He didn't join us. But Lola, Michael, myself, my little brother, my father and mother, and of course, Michael's family, they were all in this wagon, and we were leaving. Now, the only place we could go was a city called Bochnia. Bochnia had a ghetto. So that meant we had to go inside a ghetto. Now, Bochnia ghetto had a very bad reputation. What happened? Every once in a while, 2 or 3 dump trucks would come into the ghetto in the middle of the night, and they would go from house to house, pull out the children from their beds, throw them into these dump trucks. You can imagine the parents are screaming for the children are screaming for the parents. And as they filled up the 2 or 3 dump trucks, they started to pull out of the ghetto. And the parents obviously ran behind these trucks, yelling for their children. The children were screaming for the parents. And these cultured people had machine guns at the end of each truck. So as the parents are running behind the truck, they mow down the parents with machine guns in front of their children. None of these children survived. We don't know what happened to them, but we can imagine. And this resonated throughout Europe. All over Europe, people knew in the ghettos, stay away from Bochnia ghetto because of these terrible things that happened to children. But we had no choice. We had to go into that ghetto or stay in Neapolomice. And it's a good thing we left Neapolomice, because the night after, they came with trucks and they raided every Jewish house, and they pulled the people, put them in trucks, and they took them to the forest in Neapolomice. After the war, Lola and I were the only survivors. So we went back to Neapolomice to find out what happened to all the people. And this is what they told us. These farmers would go to the forest early in the morning to pick berries and mushrooms to sell in the market. And as these trucks pulled in with the Jewish people, they were hiding behind trees, and they saw what happened. The men were handed shovels and made ditches, and then everyone would mow down, and they covered them up. They said that the ground was moving for 3 or 4 days afterwards. They didn't care if they killed you or you were half alive. They buried you. This is what we found out after the war. So it's good that we left, and we arrived now in Bochnia, and we're going from street to street with the wagon. The driver was allowed to go in the ghetto as long as he left his ID with the guards by the gate, and they let him in. And as we're going up and down the street, Michael sees his buddy friend that he went to school with by the name of Farber. Farber was wearing a uniform. He was a Jewish policeman inside the ghetto. Now, inside the ghetto, you know, there were kapos, these Jewish policemen. They had a Jewish police station, and the only thing those policemen had the right to do is to keep order inside the ghetto. They had no weapons, but they had a baton, and that's all. But Farber says, "What are you doing here?" So Michael tells him the story, what happened. He says, "Don't worry, I have a place for you to move in." and he took Michael and his family and Lola to an apartment. And then he takes my father, my mother, myself, and my little brother to another apartment. Now, just to give you an idea of what ghetto living was like, it was one big room that they put us in, and there were 8 other people inside the room. So now we were 12. There were no beds. All we had is straw on the ground, and on top of the straw was blankets, and there were blankets hanging from the ceiling who were separating each family. And this is how all of us existed in one room. There was some broken down furniture, there was a stove and a table, boxes for chairs, and there was one piece of furniture that was rather outstanding because it was a beautiful piece of furniture. It was an armoire where you hang your coats and jackets. And it was a little outstanding with all this junky furniture. This nice furniture was there, and I didn't pay attention to it. So in the ghetto, we had to work. So my job, I was 12 years old now, and maybe about 12 and a half. My job was to work in a uniform factory to sew on buttons on uniforms. And if you didn't work, you didn't receive any rations. So we worked. Now, this was going on for almost a year when all of a sudden, Farber goes to Michael and says, Michael, I heard there is going to be a rumor. There is a rumor that there's going to be a raid in the ghetto, either tonight or tomorrow night. Save yourselves. Now, ever since those trucks would come in the ghetto and pull out the children from their bed, every apartment in every house had a hiding place. They called it a bunker. And that's when I found out that our bunker was this beautiful piece of furniture. Yes, you heard right. You opened the door, you push the clothing apart, the back panel would slide apart. There was a hole in the wall, and 12 of us could crawl through the hole and stand between 2 buildings. Now, lucky for us, the outside of the buildings were connected, but the roofs were open and it was snowing. It was ice cold in there. We were standing, 12 of us, holding each other and shaking, shivering. All night long, we heard screams, dogs barking. We heard our neighbors who were being torn apart by dogs. And they're screaming and shooting, yelling. Towards morning, it got quiet. When it got quiet, one of us got out to see, and he came back. He says, the coast is clear, you can come out. And all of us came out. And when we came out and we walked outside the apartment, what we saw in front of our eyes, we could never forget. There were people torn apart by dogs, mothers holding their infants, and they were all dead, laying in the snow. And there were people going around with push carts, picking up these bodies and pieces of bodies and putting them in the push carts. And then they took them to the ghetto square and they piled them up as high as they could. And these cultured people came with gasoline cans and they poured gasoline over the bodies and they started a human bonfire inside the ghetto square. To tell you that smell and the ashes flying, it was unbelievable. But it was quiet now because the Nazis pulled out with their trucks and with all the people that they could pull out of the ghetto. And I wanted to see what happened to my sister Lola and Michael and his family. And I knew that they had a hiding place, which was a doghouse. You heard right, the doghouse. You pulled the floor up, and there was a step ladder, and inside there was bedding and provisions for 7 people, room for 7 people. And Michael is telling me the story after I met him and Lola. They're telling me the story, what happened as they were about to go in. And other Jewish policeman, a capo, comes up to them by the name of Morris Schiller. Morris had his mother and his sister with him. And he says, Michael, I know about your hiding place in the doghouse. We have no idea how he found out. But he says, unless you take my sister and my mother along with you, I'm going to tell the authorities. Well, there was only room for 7. Now there were 9. So Michael and Lola decided to stay away. And as they're walking away, they're walking on the street, and this other couple by the name of Farber sees them. He says, what are you doing? Why aren't you hiding someplace? So Michael tells him the story about Morris Schiller. He says, okay, I have a place for you. Where my sister and her 2 children are hiding, there is room for you. Come with me. And he took him to a leather factory, a tannery. Above the tannery, there was a water tank. He says, my sister and her 2 children are inside that water tank. There's a step ladder. You can go in, and inside there's a rope. You can lower yourself. And towards the morning, when the coast is clear, I'll give you a certain knock on the tank. And when you hear this knock, that means the coast is clear, you can come out. Now Lola's telling the story. As they were pulling their way down into the tank, they see his sister is standing knee-deep in water. Her daughter is standing waist-high in water and shaking. And the mother is holding an infant in the hand, sound asleep. And they're all shaking and shivering. Michael picks up the girl from the water, lifts her up. Lola picks up the little infant from the mother, and they all stood in that water. The little rats that are swimming there and nibbling at their feet, water rats. All night long, they heard the same things that we heard, screaming, dogs barking, yelling. And this was going on all night. And towards morning, when it got quiet, they heard the signal from Farber on the tank. So they pulled themselves out. And after they came out and they put some circulation back into their legs, the first thing they want to do is see what happened to the doghouse with his family. And when they came to the doghouse, this is what they saw. They saw every member of the family, including the mother and daughter, were laying in the snow with a bullet hole in their head. This is a picture that Lola did from memory. Everyone. Now, Michael's sister, Marika, in the corner here, she's still holding on to a doll that Lola made her for her 7th birthday. And everyone was killed. When Lola saw that, she started to scream, and Michael stopped her, says, they may still be burning bodies, they might hear you. So with a quelched cry, they knew what they had to do. According to Jewish religion, Jewish people have to bury their loved ones within 72 hours. Michael, being a religious man, he found a rickety wheelbarrow. They put the family on. Little Marika still holding on to the doll, and Lola and Michael are pushing it up to the cemetery. On top of the cemetery, top of the mountain, they had a Jewish cemetery. They pushed them up there. And in the cemetery, they found a shovel, one shovel between them, and they're pulling out Lola with her bare hands, bloody, pulling out this frozen ground to put the family into the ground. And as soon as they put the family in the ground, Morris Schiller, that other policeman, the couple, comes up to them. He says, "It wasn't my fault." And it wasn't, because his own mother and his own sister were also killed. However, he says, the burial, the holes that you made up for your family, I want you to take your family out of there, because I want that burial for my mother and my daughter, my sister. And Lola heard that. She started to scream, and Michael says, "Look, he has the power over us." And they had to take the family out. They buried them in that other spot. And while they were doing this, they heard the Jeep coming up the road to the cemetery gate, and they stop at the gate, and two assessmen jump out, and they came inside the cemetery, and they were yelling, "Morris Schiller, Morris Schiller." He says, "Jawohl, here I am." And as soon as they walk up to him, they pull out the revolver and they shot him. This is what they did to people who have seen too much. And obviously he saw a lot, and they don't want to leave any witnesses. So they killed him. Meanwhile, Michael and Lola are going down back to their apartment, holding each other and crying. What happened from this point on, you're going to have to check out my book and find out. Living a Lives That Matters in my book and in my curriculum. It's all in there, but it's a long story how we, our family, were able to get out of the ghetto and bring a lot of people with us. It's a long story, so I'll skip it. To tell you only is that we are now in Bochnia, outside the ghetto, and we're living in a small apartment, and Michael sees a truck driver who was hauling coal, and he asked him if he would convert his truck into a double-decker, where there's coal on top, and between the coal and the chassis, people can hide, and to take them to the border of Czechoslovakia and Hungary, and Czechoslovakia border, and there would be a smuggler, and he would smuggle us through the border to Czechoslovakia. And from Czechoslovakia, we have to be smuggled into Hungary. Hungary was a free country. So anyway, what happened is Lola and Michael went first with another group of 8. There were 10 people inside this truck, laid out like sardines, and they left. And when the truck driver came back 2 days later, he had the right password, telling the rest of the family, "You can trust this driver. He delivered us to the border." So now it was time for other 8 people to go in. There was 8 people from this wealthy family who we helped to get out of the ghetto. And because of this, they're paying our way to go to be smuggled across. So with every 8 people from their family, 2 from our family, they're paying. So Lola and Michael went. My older brother, Moishi, he was arrested for forging papers of the head of the Gestapo. That's another part of the story that I don't have time to tell you. And he was now in a concentration camp. Now it was me, my little brother, and my father, my mother. Remember, my older sister is in Hungary, in Munkac. She's a free woman. So now It was my turn, my little brother, to go inside this truck. So 10 of us go in like sardines, packed together, 5 and 5, and the truck started to pull out. 2 hours outside Bochnia, we're being stopped by Nazis. Halt! And as soon as we're being stopped, we can see through the crack of the truck that they were soldiers with rifles. And they walk up to the driver and they talk to him. Even though I spoke German, I couldn't understand because the roar of the engine was so loud. He didn't shut off the engine and I couldn't hear. And all of a sudden, the truck started to move again. We were sure that somebody turned us in. They're going to take us to a forest or to a cemetery and kill all of us. And then the truck started to move. We felt maybe they're letting us go. But we looked through the crack. We see on one step, there's a soldier with a rifle. On the other step, there's a soldier with a rifle. And there are soldiers walking on top of the coal, and the coal dust is filtering through. My little brother is about to sneeze, and I'm holding his nose and mouth because I don't know if they know about us or not, but we were sure they know about us. 2 hours later, the truck stops, and we were already praying. This is it. And all of a sudden we heard, Dankeschön, Dankeschön. They were just hitchhiking. Imagine the relief that we had, like we were reborn again. And of course, a few hours later, we wound up on the top of a mountain in the forest, and it was nighttime. The truck stopped. The truck stopped, and they let us out. Forgive me, I have a little dog, and the doorbell rings, he barks. I can't help it. So now we come out of the truck, and the truck driver says, walk up into that forest about 300 yards. You'll see a tool shed. Inside the tool shed, there is the forest ranger who happened to be the smuggler. He'll smuggle you up to the border. So this is what happened. He saw us and he took us about 2 kilometers away to his house. His wife was waiting for us with a meal. We were able to clean up because we were all black, full of coal dust. But at 3 a.m., we all had to be in the forest at a certain spot because at 3 a.m. on top of the mountain, we can see the guards with their dogs going back and forth, back and forth. At 3 a.m., they go down and they meet fresh guards and they exchange places. But between exchanging places, there's a little ceremony, and that takes about 5 to 10 minutes. During that time, we have a way to cross the border. And we were all laying, and then all of a sudden we saw the guards walking down, and we started to shimmy our way up. And as we came up to the border, the smuggler held the barbed wire up and he told us to cross. But he told us that the other side of the barbed wire, there's a big drop, a big ravine, and you can fall and hurt yourself unless you sit down, hold hands, and slide down quietly. Because if you tumble and the dogs will hear you, it's all over. So this is what we did. We went to the other side. It was pitch black. You couldn't see your hand in front of you. We sat down at the edge of the mountain and we started to slide down. I'm holding my little brother, and when we came to a plateau, we stopped. I asked him, are you okay? He says, yes, he's okay. And as soon as I hear that, All of a sudden, someone taps me on my shoulder and I jump out of my skin. Who in the pitch black, you couldn't see a face. Who in the world? And he says to me, Beinisch? Beinisch was my Yiddish name, and only my parents and my brothers and sisters called me that. He says, I'm your Uncle Bela, your mother's brother, and I waited for you here. I'll cross you the border. So how did you know where in the middle of the night here in the darkness to find me? He says, when Lola and Michael went through the same spot, they contacted us and they told us where to look for you, and I waited here for you. But anyway, to tell you the story, how we crossed the border from Czechoslovakia to Hungary is again an old, big story. And I'm going to skip that, just tell you to look it up in our website or my book. Now we're in Hungary. We arrive in Hungary after smuggling through the other border the next night, and there was a wagon waiting for us, and they took us to the nearest city, little town, and there was a train station. When the train arrived, we boarded the train, and they took us to Budapest. In Budapest, we met our sister Lola and Michael. Of course, we were so happy to see each other, and they had a big meal for us, and we still had to do something to legalize me. I had to take my little brother, and my uncle had to take us to a jail. We had to go into a jail, and they had to legally take us out of jail. My uncle had to vouch that he will be our guardian. Since we were still underage, he agreed to be our guardian. And sure enough, he got us out of there, and we left on a train, and we went to Munkac, where my sister Goldie lived, and my grandparents, my uncles, cousins, the whole family were waiting for us. And when we arrived, we were so happy to see them. And Munkac was a free city. People were going to dances, were going to theaters and nightclubs. Life was going on as normal. And when I told people what's happening to Jewish people in Poland, most of them didn't believe it. And those who did believe, like my family, they said, but this will never happen in Hungary, because Hungary is an ally of Germany. Why would Hitler siphon off soldiers from a front to occupy a friendly country? And this was in the end of 1943. Certainly, Hitler knew he was losing the war by then. So it wouldn't happen. But my uncle, who invited me to stay in his house, he was a very wealthy man, and he had a factory of yardage. He was selling yardage goods for suits and dresses. And above the store, they had a house, and he was wealthy. And he invited us to stay in his house. And I told my uncle, I says, Uncle, if the Nazis ever come into Hungary, they will take all your valuables away from you. It would be nice if you converted some of your valuables into diamonds or gold to put it in a pocket or hide it. And he listened to me. And one day he came home with boxes full of shoes. And he told us that in the heels of these shoes, there are diamonds. Use it only in a life-threatening situation. He believed us. And sure enough, in March of 1944, a few months later, the Nazis just marched into Hungary like they were invited guests. When they came into Hungary, they knew every Jewish person where they lived. They knew our ages, our education, our businesses. How? How in the world, there were no computers in those days. IBM had punch cards, and IBM doesn't deny it. They sold those punch cards to whoever is going to pay the price. And they sold it to the Nazis, but they didn't know for what purpose they're going to use it. So they sold it to them. And they, of course, rounded up all the Jewish people. And within 4 to 6 weeks, they were already shuttling Jewish people to death camps. Now, this is what they told us. They told us Germany needs workers, and you will all be relocated to Germany. Bring along all your valuables and that you can carry. Leave everything behind. Everyone found hiding will be shot. And he said, in Germany, you will be able to live with your family. Children will go to school, older people will be cared for, and young people will be working. Germany needs workers. And we all believed that most people never heard of death camps. So they all came and they dragged along all of their belongings, valises, suitcases, and they lined us up in a railroad station 80 to cattle car. Now, 80 to cattle car wouldn't be bad, except that people had all these bundles and valises. It was so tight that if somebody wanted to sit down, someone else had to stand up. So as we're waiting to go in, I see 2 men are carrying a stretcher and they set him down in front of my feet. And I take a look, it's my sister Goldie, all beaten up like blue, we couldn't recognize her. Goldie, what happened to you? She says, I tried to escape and I went as far as the railroad station, and a Hungarian gendarme who went to school with me recognized me. He turned me over to the SS and they beat her to a pulp. Now they order us to go into the cattle wagon. We had to help Goldie, of course, she couldn't do it herself to get in. It was so tight inside. And in the corner, they had 2 buckets of water. And after the water was gone, there were no sanitary facilities, no toilets. So 80 people, old people, young people, mothers, babies, infants, screaming, yelling. You can't imagine what was going on. And there was no way to relieve yourself. So they used those 2 buckets to relieve ourselves. 1 day, 2 days, now the 2 buckets got filled up. And the 3rd day, it's overflowing. Now we were happy we can sit on bundles instead of on the ground in the human waste. After the 3rd day, on the 3rd night, we arrived at a place and we go through a station and we see lit up, it says Oświęcim. Oświęcim is Auschwitz for German for Auschwitz, Polish for Auschwitz. Now, we didn't know about Oświęcim, we didn't know about Auschwitz. It was new to us, but the train didn't stop. It just kept going. And it stopped about a few hundred yards away. And when we're inside, we take a look through the gate and we see a gate, and on top of the gate, it says, Arbeit macht frei, labor gives you freedom. Well, that made sense to us. It means it's a labor camp. This is probably where we will be working. We didn't know about Auschwitz, that was Auschwitz. But the train stood there for an hour or 2, and then it moved again. And it moved for another 300 yards or something like that, and it stopped again. And it was still nighttime. They opened the gate and they started to scream and yell, "Raus, raus, schnell." You heard the Germans and the dogs barking, and they were inmates with striped clothes yelling, "Leave all your belonging where it is." They were yelling in different languages. "Don't you pick anything up, leave it alone." Women and children to the right, men to the left, and I'm holding on to my sister, my little brother, Tuli, and we were just ripped apart, never to see each other again. This was Auschwitz, and it was nighttime. And I didn't know about Auschwitz. I didn't know what it meant, but they had selections. But while we're standing in line, we see ashes are flying, and we see chimneys with flames shooting out at nighttime, 5 chimneys all over the place. And the man in front of me were saying, "Oh, those must be smelting factories. This is probably where we will be working." Who knew? We didn't know. We didn't know that these ashes were ashes from our dear departed ones, our loved ones. And as we're going forward, I see a man in a white frock and white gloves. He's going like this, right, left, right, left. That was Dr. Mengele. I didn't know about the Dr. Mengele, but we see a doctor and we just move forward towards him. And as we come closer, I hear him ask a young man a question. He said, "Kannst du 5 kilometers laufen? Can you run 5 kilometers, or would you rather go by truck?" And this person says, I had a bad knee. I would rather go by truck." Who knew? That poor guy was sent to the death chambers. That meant killing. We had no idea, but something didn't make sense to me. I was 15 and a half years old at the time, and I figured to myself, why would they ask such a question? I can see barracks, we are in a camp. I figured he's asking that to test us, to see if we're strong enough to work. So I tell my uncle, my cousin, I says, "Let me go first. And whatever he asks you, tell him, yes, you can run 5 kilometers. Yes, you're healthy. You can work." And I went first. And I come in front of this doctor. I stretch myself out because I was only 15 and a half. And I saluted him. And I said, "18 Jahre alt, gesund und arbeitsfähig." I'm 18 years old. I'm healthy and I can work. So he did ask me, "Kannst du 5 kilometers laufen? Can you run 5 kilometers?" And I said, "Jawohl, yes." And he sent me to the left. Well, anyway, they took us in to a big building, a brick building, and inside it was like a big auditorium, and they ordered us to all get undressed and go to the front of these barbers who will cut your hair, and then you'll go to the showers. Well, we all get undressed. Remember, my uncle gave me these diamond shoes, and his son, they all had diamond shoes. They got out of it. They had to get out of the shoes. I decided to keep them on. I says, "What's going to happen? They're going to tell me, take it off. I'll take it off." I had no idea that we were in a death camp. So I go in front of these barbers naked, but with these beautiful black shoes. They cut my hair all over my body. They weren't exactly gentle the way they did it. And then they tell me to go into the bath. They didn't say anything about my shoes. In the bathhouse, I took a shower. Afterwards, they blew us off. They put DDT on all over us, and they gave us striped clothes, uniforms, and they also handed us a string, and the bottom of the string was disc. The disc was 41212. That was my number. From that day on, I was no longer Ben Lesser. I was 41212. And you had to wear this all the time. They also gave us a pair of shoes, wooden soles with canvas on top. And I got into those shoes and I put my beautiful black shoes, wet shoes, under my arm and my jacket. And they march us out to go to the barrack. And when we came to the barrack, the Stubenälteste, the man in charge of the barrack, comes out and he counts us. And then he talks to us in a broken German. And I can tell that he was from Poland by his accent. He says, "Ha, you Hungarian Jews, you think you're here on vacation? Think again. You see those chimneys, those ashes? Those are your mothers, your fathers, your brothers, and your sisters. And if you don't behave, this is how you're going to wind up. If you don't do exactly what you're told, you're going to wind up ashes." He couldn't believe what we said. I don't have the time to tell you what happened from this day on. I was in Auschwitz for 2 weeks with my uncle, my cousin. What we went through is unbelievable. And what my little head heard, what was going on in Auschwitz with all the killing. And the other we were one barrack away from a fiery pit where they were throwing in infants and little children and adults alive into fiery pits because they didn't have time enough to gas all these people. The Hungarian Jews were coming in train after train. They had to kill 4,500 people, between 45 and 6,000 a day. And they didn't have time sometimes to gas everybody. I can't tell you all the stories that I heard. And then they put us in trucks and they took us to a labor camp. The labor camp was called Dürnhau, D-O-Umlau, Dürnhau. And Dürnhau was a rock quarry. This was our labor camp. As they dynamited the mountain and boulders were coming down, it was our job with sledgehammers to break these boulders into manageable pieces, pick them up, throw them into a mining cart, run them down the hill to a grinding machine to grind it into gravel, then push it back up. And this, of course, was very hard, back-breaking work. And I figured my uncle will never survive this. So I bribed the chef from the kitchen with my diamonds in my shoes to give my uncle a job in the kitchen. And he took the diamonds and he gave him a job. So it got a little easier for us because my uncle was now working there. And every day as we came back from work in the evening, every person in the camp who was working in the kitchen everywhere, they had to come into the line to be counted. And as they're counting us, and counting us, they wouldn't dismiss us. And finally, the commandant comes down with his Fräulein, his girlfriend. He says, "I'm going to teach the Schweinhund a lesson they'll never forget." What happened? 3 inmates escaped. And because of this, he's ordering his henchmen to pull out every 10th person to receive 25 lashes. So as they're counting every 10th person, I can see they're going to pull out my uncle who's in front of me. I push him behind me, and I took his place. And I took number 10 in the yard. They took us number 10s, and they brought down bundles of 1 by 1 hardwood stakes about 2 feet long to 2.5 feet long. And they brought down a horseshoe, sawhorse, I'm sorry, a sawhorse. And this is what they ordered us to do. Tiptoe, bend over the sawhorse, but your stomach cannot touch the 2x4 on top. One man would pull your trousers and the other one does the hitting, and you have to count out loud. If you miscount, you start from one again. If your heels touch the ground, you start from one again. If your stomach touches the 2x4, you start from one again. It was almost impossible. I was number 4. Number 1 goes up, and after he miscounted and his heel touched the ground again and again, he finally collapsed. And as he collapsed, the commandant goes over, kicks him in the face. He says, "Get up." The poor guy couldn't. The commandant pulls out the revolver and shoots him. He kills him. His Fräulein, his girlfriend, goes over to him, gives him a hug and a kiss, like he just performed a heroic act. Number 2 goes up. The same way, he miscounts and his heel touches the ground, his stomach touches the 2x4. It starts again and again. And every time they hit him on the behind, you can see a line of blood coming right through. They hit you so hard with those sharp stakes. And he fell apart, he fell down. The commandant goes over, kicks him in the face, stand up. He couldn't. He pulls out the revolver and shoots him. So we have 2 dead men. The 3rd man goes up. I was number 4. The 3rd man goes up, and he too miscounted. His heel touched the ground. They start again and again. Finally, he yells out, he says, "Have mercy on me, don't kill me." So the commandant says, "Then get up, come over here and face me." The poor guy stands up, makes 5 steps, and his knees gave up from under him, and he fell. The minute he fell, he goes over and shoots him. So we had 3 dead bodies. Ben Lesser is next in line. All I can tell you is I walked up to this horseshoe, sawhorse, bent over, tiptoed, and I said to myself, "Ben, if you want to live another hour, you better do it exactly the way he says." And I walk over and I tiptoe, and one man is pulling my trousers real tight. The other one starts to hit, and I start to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Finally, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 25. I made it. When I made it, you can hear a pin drop in the whole camp because no one believed that anyone can survive this. The man who was holding my trousers tells me in Yiddish, he says, "Go over and thank the commandant." I walk over, blood's running down my legs, and I salute him and I say, "Danke schön, Herr Kommandant." "Thank you very much, Sir Commandant." He says, when he hears that, he puts his hand on my collar, a shirt collar, twists me around, facing the number 10s who are still to be beaten. He says, "Now I told you it could be done. If you do it like this, Junge, if you do it like this, young one, you have nothing to worry about." And while he is saying this, there's a commotion at the gate. They pulled in those 3 inmates. They caught them, all bloodied. And when the commandant saw that, just like a child who gets sick of a toy, he told us number 10s to go back in our line. And he orders his henchmen to bring down a portable gallows, and they hung those 3 men in front of us one by one, and we had to watch. If you dared to close your eyes, you were whipped. I will never forget the third man. They put the noose around him, and he started to say a prayer called Shema, Shema Yisrael. It's a Hebrew prayer, only 6 words before you die. And when they heard that, they kicked the stool out from under him. They wouldn't let him complete the last 2 words. And of course, he died. They were such sadists. And then they dismissed us like nothing ever happened. And we went for our rations, and we went up to the barrack. And of course, I couldn't lay on my back for weeks because of the welts. But thanks God, everything healed up. And now, one night we hear cannon fire. The front was closing in. And when we report to work in the morning, there's a loudspeaker said, no one is going to work today. You're all being evacuated from Durnau. So he says, line up, rows of 5. And I had my cousin with me. Now his father, my uncle, was already in the kitchen working, so he couldn't say goodbye to us. We never saw him again. And we marched out. That was called a death march. Why they call it the death march? If you could not keep up pace with the soldiers, they simply shot you. And all day long you heard pop, pop, pop shootings all the time. And 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. I found out recently that it was 7 weeks that we marched. I didn't even remember how many days or weeks. It all mixed up together. And the last 2 weeks, both of our shoes, my cousin and I, our shoes fell apart, and there was snow on the ground. So we marched with our bare feet on the snow, and we had to keep up with the soldiers, because if we slowed down, they would shoot us. And finally, after 7 weeks, we arrived at Buchenwald, in one of the big camps. And when we arrived to Buchenwald, they count us. They told us to go into this barrack, and they will feed you. You'll take a shower. They'll give you fresh clothes, which they did. And we took a shower. There I am inside the shower. And this is a story in itself, which I can't tell you. You'll find it on my website. So apparently a soldier took a picture of me in the bathhouse. And the next morning, we all came out there, they counted us, and they marched us out of Buchenwald, because Buchenwald is also being evacuated. And as they're marching us out, about 300 yards, we see cattle cars lined up. And they count us, 82 cattle cars, and they told us to go in. I tell my cousin, I pushed him up. I says, go find a place next to a wall so we can rest our back against the wall. I remember going to Auschwitz in a cattle car. People all around you was terrible. So he did. He found a good spot for me and himself. And 80 of us went in, they closed the door. An hour later, they opened the gate and they threw in 80 breads, a bread for each person. Picture this. Those people who were next to the door were grabbing 4 or 5 breads. And I and my cousin were against the wall. We had nothing. We don't know where we're going, for how long we're going to be gone. I had to get the bread. My cousin was too weak. And I started to climb over the sitting inmates' heads. And one of the inmates had a pocket knife. He didn't like the idea, and he stabs me in my throat. And I feel a stab, and my mouth is full of blood, but I have to get a bread. And I keep climbing, and this man had 4 or 5 breads. I pull one bread out of him, and he punches me. And at that point, I came back. My cousin says, what happened? I put my finger, it went right through my tongue. How we survived 1 week, 2 weeks, and the one loaf of bread which I rationed every night, the size of a half an egg, to my cousin and me, was gone after 2 weeks. And now the third week, everybody around me is dying. And we arrive at a place called Dachau. And they ordered us, those people who can walk out of the barrack, out of the cattle car, walk into the barracks inside the camp. And I and my cousin, we got into the camp. Maybe out of the 80 of us in the cattle car, maybe 5 of us walked out. And I found out later that from that cattle car, which were over 3,000 people, only 18 of us walked out in Dachau. And my cousin was one of the 18. And today, the only survivor is myself. I'm the only survivor. Everybody in this cattle car where I was dead. There was no way we could survive without water, without food for 3 weeks. And the fact that I and my cousin survived was a miracle. And we came into Dachau, and we see a mountain full of dead bodies in front of the crematorium. And I guess they ran out of coal. They couldn't burn the bodies. They put us in a barrack right next to these dead bones. And inside the barrack, we're laying there 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. And after 3 days, we hear, Befreiung, Befreiung, Americans, Americans. And I tell my cousin, let's go out and see. And as we hold each other and walk out, we see our inmates are crawling on our hands and knees and kissing the boots from the GIs. They looked like gods to us. They liberated us. And I go into the middle of the yard, and the American GI walks up to me with a can full of Spam. He opens it up and he hands it to me. We made a mistake. It smelled so good, and we ate some of it. Both of us came down with dysentery. That night after liberation, my cousin dies in my arms. And I talk to him, and I keep talking to him. And somebody saw it, and they came and took him away. And as they took him away, I followed. And as I followed, my knees gave out, and I fell. When I fell, they put me at the end of the barrack, and I lay there for about 4 or 5 hours. And then a man comes up to me, nicely dressed. He introduces himself in Polish, and he asked me if I speak Polish. I says, yes. He says he's a Jesuit priest. He came with a bunch of nuns and doctors from France, and they're opening up a field hospital in the camp of Dachau. And he's going to take me to the field hospital. He picks me up like a bag of bones. He puts me on top of his shoulder, which I was. I was only weighing about 60 or 65 pounds at the age of 16. And he takes me to the infirmary, and he told me something I'll never forget. He says, Benek, what you went through just because you were born to Jewish parents, this is terrible. But don't you ever forget, and don't you ever abandon your noble religion. To hear that from a Jesuit priest in 1945 was highly unusual. I never forgot it. He took me inside the infirmary, and none came over. They took my vitals. They put me on a cot with a white sheet on it, and I passed out. 2.5 months later, I wake up in a monastery in Bavaria called Santo Tilian. This is where I wake up. The monks gave up one building to make a hospital out of it, to rehabilitate the survivors. So this is where I was born. 2.5 months later, I woke up. What happened from this day on is another story in itself. And my dear teachers, you can all find out how I met my sister and how she was the only survivor, and how we met, and how I joined a Zionist group. I was going to Palestine to fight for my own country, because figuring that if the Jewish people had our own land, this would have never happened. As it happened, the whole world stood by silent, and this could never happen if we had our own country. So I wanted to build the land from where we were dispersed from Judea. And I didn't get to Judea, to Palestine. It's a whole long story, but this is my family today. And this is my sister Lola, her son, who was born in Santa Tillian, and her daughter. And this is a family they created. And life started all over again. This is her other son. Well, if you have any questions, I don't know if I have any time, but I'll gladly answer them for you.
Ben, thank you so much for everything that you have just shared with us. And I know that you didn't have enough time to share all of it, but I think we are probably out of time. But we can maybe encourage anybody who has any questions. If you want to send them to me, I'd be happy to send them on to Gail or Ben, and perhaps get back with you on those things. But I think it was more important for us to hear your story, and we appreciate that very much. Gail, do you want to end with maybe just one or two more things, and then we'll wrap it up?
Okay. Hi. I'm always so moved, and I can't tell you how many times a week I hear the story or parts of it. I think mainly, I think Ben's message is to you teachers, just to let you know also, this is a Holocaust survivor. We're not a big foundation or big organization. This is a survivor that felt that his story needed to be told and that needed to live on for future generations to learn from. And so this is what he did. He went and he's reached into his pockets to make sure that this educational program was out there for future generations, and everything is there to live on, to live on a website. As a matter of fact, Zahor gets, before the family in the will, it goes, Zahor is taken care of first. So don't you worry, it will live on forever. And we need the generous, we need for you to be able to tell people about it, for you to be able to read Ben's book and continue the stories and the words that Ben has told you today. I think Ben might have one last final message.
Well, all I can say is that while individuals can't always choose what happens to them, but whether it's a crisis or calamity, people can choose to either let it ruin their lives or to learn from it and move forward. It's essential to understand the consequences of personal choices. It's possible to let tragedy or trauma become a reason to stop living, but it's also possible to live through extreme circumstances and commit to a life that has meaning, a life that matters.